Uncertainty really does feel overwhelming right now. It feels like that's all we're thinking about, talking about, and seeing. It is everywhere. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about how this might impact Vancouver's real estate market. Specifically, what is Vancouver's unique position here, and what might be the influence of tariffs on Vancouver and its real estate market. Some of these are good and some of these are bad, and I'm going to break it all down. But at the very end, you're going to want to stay tuned because I'm going to talk about my biggest concern when it comes to tariffs, and it's probably not what you're thinking. Let's get into it right now. My name is Sebastian Albrecht with Living in Vancouver, BC team. Welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, this channel is all about moving to and living in Vancouver. I put up videos just like this one every single week. And this week we're talking about the influence of tariffs on the Vancouver real estate market, something that's top of mind of so many people at the beginning of 2025 in Vancouver and all across Canada. Let's start with new construction. This might be where we see the biggest influence of these new tariffs. And specifically with the threat of tariffs from the United States, the response from Canada is that we're going to match these dollar for dollar.
If it comes to that, our response, of course, be firm and clear. We will stand up for Canadian workers. We will stand up for Canadian industries.
So the result is Canadians are going to have to pay more for a lot of things that we import from the United States. And something that we don't realize, I think many of us, is how much of construction materials come from the United States. And specifically, I have a list here: glass, appliances, hardware and ceramics, iron, steel, and aluminum. Together, this combines to almost $20 billion that we import from the United States. And this is a significant input into our new construction. Whether you're building houses, townhouses, or condos in Canada, you are likely building them with supplies that are coming from the United States. And suddenly these supplies are going to be 25% more expensive as we place tariffs on these imports. And the result is, more than likely, the cost of a new home is going to increase 10 to 15%. Those are the numbers that we're seeing bandied about today. I do want to point out, even having those tariffs in place isn't absolutely certain. There is currently just a threat, as I'm talking now in late February of 2025, of having these tariffs. We still do not know for sure that they're going to be put in place. At the moment, what we're doing is basically just guessing at what these impacts might be. So the prediction is that a new home could cost, because of these tariffs, 10 to 15% more. And of course, a developer can't swallow those costs, and they're going to have to pass them on to the consumer. So the outcome is that you as a consumer may have to pay more for a new home. And those new homes, as a result, as they become more expensive, are probably going to become less desirable and less attractive. And so those people who might have bought a new home, whether it's an investor or an end user, may decide not to purchase that new home and may decide to buy something that's pre-existing. And as a result, we're going to see most likely more demand for pre-existing homes. The existing homes that are being resold will likely increase as the cost of new homes increases and the demand for them decreases as a result. Additionally, the other thing that's going to happen is that, and is already happening, is that developers are going to become increasingly cautious. There is so much risk involved in building new homes. When something like this degree of uncertainty gets input into the system, it turns a lot of those developers extremely cautious. The result is basically that new construction projects may be delayed, and the supply of new construction that we may see in the future is likely to decline. And this again could drive up prices as demand may remain the same. The demand that we see in our market, people still need homes. People are still getting married, getting divorced, having children, and they still need to live somewhere. We have talked endlessly in the last few years about how little supply in our market there is, and the government is trying to add supply to the market. They're trying to encourage development, but this might be something that discourages development and may be working against our best laid plans, something that we didn't foresee and we didn't think likely. So the result of these tariffs with new construction is that the cost of that new construction is going to increase, the supply of that new construction is likely to decrease, and then pre-existing homes are likely to see an increase in demand. And all of those inputs that we talked about for new construction also apply for the existing homes, because so often when people buy an existing home, what do they plan on doing? They plan on doing a renovation. So if you're planning on putting in new windows, buying new appliances, or putting in a new roof, all of those materials are going to potentially have tariffs in place in the not too distant future. And that is going to make any kind of renovation, any kind of upgrades that you make on your existing home considerably more expensive. And similar to the cost of new construction, we're talking about somewhere in the range of 10 to 15%. And so once again, there's upward pressure, there's inflation pressures here on new construction, on renovations, and on existing homes as a result. And it's not just for people that are renovating individual homes, it's also for stratas. And so if a strata needs to do any kind of work, and as you've heard me talking in past videos, owning a home is like owning a car. That car needs to be maintained, it needs to be taken into the mechanic. And it's the same thing with a house. The house needs to be maintained, things need to be upgraded and fixed. And if you are looking at stratas, the way that this is going to impact you is that your maintenance fees are likely to increase. And this is something we've seen in our market increase quite rapidly in the last 4 or 5 years or so with increasing inflation pressures. That is only likely to continue. The cost of doing any kind of work, whether it is replacing the windows or replacing the roof or replacing the asphalt in the driveway, all of these things are going to be costing 10 to 15% more. It's the material input costs that are going to increase in value and impact your maintenance fees. This is something that we've seen in the last few years, this inflation of maintenance fees, but this is likely only to continue if these tariffs are put into effect. Now, after 3 pretty negative points, I'm going to get into something a little more positive, but keep in mind, I still have my most concerning topic at the very end of this video. But now that we're getting into something a little more positive, I want to talk about interest rates. And interest rates in our market have not been a very positive thing in the last couple of years. A lot of us, I think, are a bit gun shy in thinking about and talking about interest rates. And of course, so many of us in 2025 and 2026 are going to be renewing mortgages in Canada. The likelihood is our economy is going to be shrinking. That is what the Bank of Canada predicts, that the GDP is going to decline by about 1.5%. I think it was 1.4% specifically. This isn't going to be even across the board, and I'm going to talk about this in a little more specific detail about the city of Vancouver in a moment. But right now, I just want to point out that 1.4 is what the Bank of Canada is predicting as the influence of these tariffs on the Canadian economy. But in terms of the British Columbia economy, it's only 0.6%. So it's a smaller decline. But because we are likely to see a shrinking economy, typically what the Bank of Canada does in those situations, they use the primary tool at their disposal, which is reducing interest rates. And that's something that we've seen trying to fight inflation in recent months. But in this case, it would be to try and fight a shrinking economy, trying to get people and businesses into the economy and spending more money. And if our economy is shrinking despite inflation increasing, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because to be fair, the Bank of Canada is saying they need to consider exactly how things are going to play out. They haven't actually committed to one route or another, but most people feel that it's likely that interest rates would decline, and perhaps decline substantially, if the economy is hard hit by the tariffs. Now, obviously, if we see a decline in interest rates, that is a positive thing for the direction of the real estate market. That is going to boost demand, and it is likely to push prices upward. Now, of course, that is only positive if you actually own real estate. For those on the outside looking in, that's not going to be such a positive thing as property continues to become more expensive. And as property does become more expensive, the likelihood is that it's not just purchasing real estate that becomes more expensive, but it's also rental rates that become more expensive to match the increasing cost of owning real estate. Let's talk real briefly about immigration as well. And I think this is something important to consider, because it's pretty clear that immigration plays a big role in Vancouver's real estate market. If we have a lot of people moving here, it drives up demand. And as I've talked about in other videos, our market is so incredibly small. Just a small increase in the number of people that come here, an increase in that demand, really impacts the supply that's on the market and really impacts prices as well. And the thing is, as the United States potentially becomes less desirable for immigrants, having a political environment that's maybe not as welcoming to immigrants, people are going to be looking for alternatives. And yes, the Canadian government has indicated we want a reduced number of immigrants, but perhaps we can become more picky about the immigrants that are coming to Canada. And another thing that is happening in the United States, at least what I've been hearing on surface levels, is something that they're looking at is reducing the number of tech workers that are coming into the United States. Well, what country would they be looking at as a close second place, or maybe a third place? Maybe it's Australia, maybe it's Great Britain, but one of the places that they are certainly going to be considering is Canada. And so increasing the quality of immigrants and increasing the economic level at which those immigrants are is going to have an impact, a potential impact on Vancouver's real estate market. And I think that's something that perhaps we're not really considering just yet. It could have an impact on the direction of prices and demand in our market. Whether you're immigrating or migrating to Vancouver, if you're looking to purchase in Vancouver, well, I can help you. I've helped hundreds of families settle in Vancouver, and I can help you and your family as well. Help you find the right home and the right neighborhood, wherever it might be in Metro Vancouver. All it is a conversation whenever you're ready. Reach out anytime, and let's get back to the video. So now let's talk about the potential economic impact on the city of Vancouver. In my mind, I view Vancouver as being one of those places that is less susceptible to an economic impact from tariffs. We're talking about parts of Canada that are probably more prone to primary resource industries and also manufacturing. I think those are going to be the areas that are hardest hit. So we're talking about areas like Alberta, and we're talking about areas in Ontario and Quebec, areas where manufacturing and industry is quite heavy. As I've talked about in other videos, Vancouver is a very much service-based, technology-based, information-based economy. And so we're not an economy that is as susceptible to these tariffs. We're a considerably diversified economy. And I can say that this is backed up by some research that was done recently. I believe it was by the Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, but they ranked Canadian cities in terms of their susceptibility, their risk in terms of these potential tariffs. And Vancouver, of 41 cities across Canada, ranked 32nd. It was far down the list. And in fact, many BC cities are way down the list. And I'm talking about whether it's Chilliwack or Abbotsford or Victoria. I think Victoria was actually below Vancouver on that list, and Abbotsford was higher. But Metro Vancouver, to a large degree, is viewed as a less susceptible area, and primarily because so little of our economy is based on trade with the United States. Vancouver itself, I'm just double checking my numbers here, 8.5% of its GDP is based on trade with the United States versus 20% across Canada as a whole. So we're well below the average. And the other thing I want to keep in mind is that Vancouver is an international port on the west coast of Canada. We have very strong international trade ties. We can very quickly switch from trading with the United States to Asia Pacific nations all around the world. And so that's an option that other cities across Canada may not necessarily have. They don't have that easy access that we would here in Vancouver. I think it's also important to note that the potential of a falling loonie, and that is what is going to happen most likely if we do go into recession, and that is part of the prediction that the Canadian economy as a whole would likely go into recession if these tariffs are put in place. The result would be that our dollar would drop in comparison to the United States, but this might actually positively impact some industries. And I've read some things recently. One in particular would be TV and movie production here in Vancouver, that already the industry in LA and California is quite concerned about the outcome of these tariffs because they know that so many productions would be motivated to move to Vancouver and away from California because it's going to be a lot cheaper for them. This could also be a role with video game and software production. And IT is such a big part of our economy here locally that we could see an increasing number of movement of businesses here to the Lower Mainland and perhaps out of the United States as the environment for encouraging immigration and tech workers from other countries is not going to be such a positive one. We have an opportunity to make that a little more positive here in Canada and specifically here in Vancouver. The other thing is tourism. And I've seen this talked about in other markets, but I think if we do see a falling dollar, there may be a considerable number of Americans that want to come here, but also people from around the world. They're going to view, if they haven't been able to afford to come here, or they view Vancouver as a solid option when other areas may be more expensive. So we may see an increasing number of international tourists, but I also think there's a move for Canadians to resist traveling elsewhere, and specifically in the United States. So I see a lot of people talking about not going to the United States, for canceling their vacation plans and making alternate arrangements in Canada. I think that Vancouver is at the forefront of many people's minds for where they might want to spend some vacation dollars and some vacation time. So we could see a benefit to our tourism industry here in Vancouver. And all three of these, whether it's TV and movie production, whether it's IT or tourism, these are all big parts of the industry and the economy in Vancouver. And we could see a big boost in all of these economies. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about where my biggest concern lies, because to be honest, I don't really think that we're really all that at risk from these tariffs. Yes, I think there could be negative impacts. And yes, I think some things are going to become more expensive. But to be honest, I think we're going to figure it out. And I think that Vancouver is one of those places in Canada that is prone, less susceptible to the threat of these tariffs. We have alternatives, and there's going to be some positive impacts. But here is where my concern is, and that is in market sentiment. And I can harken back to the beginning of my career. I started in real estate in 2007. Way back in 2008 was the beginning of my career, and I was having a real tough time getting going. But that market and the economic turmoil of what was happening in the United States, we were caught up in that. And predominantly, that was just psychological. We were inundated with all of the negative press of what was happening in the United States, but it actually wasn't happening here. We had a much more solid banking system. We had much more conservative lending practices. And the result was that our market was on really solid structural foundations, unlike so much of the United States, which saw a whole lot of economic turmoil as a result. But the thing was, we were psychologically impacted by what was going on in the United States, being inundated by all of that negative news. And right now reminds me of that moment to a large degree. I think that the psychology of the moment is quite negative, and we're being inundated with a lot of negativity and a lot of uncertainty, something that we're not really familiar with here in Vancouver and in Canada in general. So my concern is that we see a repeat of what had happened in 2008. That was a year that we saw sales decline by 45%, almost 50% less, almost half of what happened the previous year, almost exclusively because of market sentiment and psychology. And the prices fell about 15%. So at the time, many of the realtors that I encountered that had been in the market for a very long time talked about exactly how bad it was. And it was the worst market, they said, that they had seen in their entire careers and in their entire lifetimes. And many of those realtors had been in the business 20, 30, 40 years. 2008 was the worst they had seen, and we only saw a 15% decline in prices. So I think worst case scenario in my mind is that if we really do struggle here, I think that it's going to be due to the sentiment, it's going to be due to the psychology of the market. And these things, I am not an economist, as you probably can tell working through this video. I don't want to pretend to be, but what I do understand is psychology and sentiment being a real estate agent. And it's something that I'm quite concerned about in the moment. I think there's a very strong potential that these things never result in anything. I think there's a lot of bluster. I think there's a lot of talk and positioning. I think there's going to be a bunch of negotiation that goes on. I think that there is going to be some uncertainty in our market for some time. Whether or not it gets to the point where it really does negatively impact market sentiment and market psychology, I'm not sure. I'm hopeful that it doesn't. I am not feeling it myself. I hear other people talking about it, but I honestly haven't found for myself that I've seen it with any of my clients. Nobody has pulled back completely. This isn't a significant part of what they're thinking about, but it is something that people are talking about at the water cooler, and it is going to impact decisions. And you do want to make an informed decision. I do think one of the things that we are going to be seeing is probably there's going to be where it is going to impact more than most is with investors. Investors are not emotionally driven. They're very factual. They don't have to buy now if they don't want to. And so they may resist moving forward when there's a degree of uncertainty in the market. I think a typical homeowner is not going to be able to change their mind. If you have just gotten divorced, if you just had triplets, if somebody in your family just died and you're the executor of the estate, all of those transactions have to happen anyways. You're not going to be able to hold off for that long. So I think to a large degree, there's unlikely to be too much of an immediate impact. But in the long term, my concern is with the psychology of the market. And I think the worst case is that we may see something like what we saw in 2008, and it may mirror along those lines. But I don't think our economy is in as big of trouble due to these tariffs as the rest of Canada is. So those are my thoughts on the risk of these potential tariffs on Vancouver's real estate market. I really do appreciate you watching this video. And if you are thinking of moving to Vancouver, if you're one of those people that's going to act whether or not these tariffs are in place, feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk about these potential tariffs, if you want to talk about buying a home in Vancouver and finding the right place and finding the right home. As I've said before, I've helped hundreds and hundreds of families do exactly what you're looking to be doing. And so I'm happy to help advise you and your family in that same move. If you're not quite ready to do that, I do have over 100 videos now all about moving to Vancouver, all about living in Vancouver. And I put these videos out every single week. So be sure to subscribe, hit the like button down below if you enjoyed this video, and be sure to comment as well if you have some other ideas on how these tariffs might be impacting Vancouver's real estate market. If you agreed with me, if you didn't agree with me, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to see you on next week's video.